welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us in this webinar. As some of you probably know, this is the second series of our webinars. Sorry, I just closed my WhatsApp, otherwise you'll hear the beeping. And we are actually starting with a bang because as first speaker, we have Cesar Hidalgo. And normally you say this speaker doesn't need an introduction and you don't really mean it all the time. But this time I mean it. Cesar really doesn't need an introduction because his fame precedes him. So he has... I'm reading from your Wikipedia entry, and it says you are Chilean, Spanish, and American. So you beat me also in the number of citizenship, since I only have 2, but you have 3, so Chilean, Spanish, and American. Physicist, of course, even though we all know of him for his work on economic complexity. Author, entrepreneurs. He now has a chair at the University of Toulouse, and also is visiting professor at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Science. And previously he was at MIT. I guess all of you know a little bit of his history. He won several prizes, and I really urge you to go and look at his bio to see how successful he has been over the years. He has an impressive amount of citations. So I know it's not an official source of citation, but just to have a sense, I looked at Google Scholar. He now almost has 19,000 citations. So, the next step will be round that up to 20,000, which is an impressive amount of citations. He published in, I don't know, you can name the journal and he has published in them. But of course, Nature, Science, are probably the 2 that stand out the most when you look at his CV, although he published in a lot of other very, very prestigious academic journals. So we are immensely grateful to Cesar for accepting our invitation, because we know how busy he is, and it allows us to really start with our series with a really, really big name. If you're interested a little bit about our series and you want to know a little bit more, Sandro just put on the chat the link where you can actually see who are going to be the next speakers. We do 1 webinar per week, and this second series will end on December 9th. So, you have time to pick and choose other speakers if you actually like the way we're doing it. I also have to do a couple of technical communications. The first one is that we are recording this seminar via Zoom. So if you are connected to Zoom, in a sense, when you will speak or whatever, you are kind of agreeing to be recorded. If not, you can move on to the live streaming on YouTube. And Gloria Cicerone, who is a postdoc at the GSSI, is collecting questions also on streaming in YouTube. So if you actually want to leave the Zoom meeting and go to the streaming, you can still ask questions. And Gloria will actually pass the question to us at the end of the talk. Cesar, you have about an hour, and then we leave a little bit of time for discussion, which is probably the most enjoyable part of it all. Thank you very much. Up to you.
Thank you, Alessandra. And first of all, to thank Alessandra, Gloria, Sandro for inviting me to be part of this event. I think after that great introduction, I have nothing to do but to disappoint, but I'm going to try to do the best that I can, showing you a little bit of my forthcoming work. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present you a book that is coming out online on September 29. It's called How Humans Judge Machines, and it's going to come out on print on February of next year. It was a peer-reviewed book with MIT Press, and the book, basically tries to explore how people judge machines compared to humans, because a few years ago, I had the feeling that many people were making claims about, algorithmic bias or about different problems that machine learning has, without having proper counterfactuals of how they would react to humans doing the same thing. So without further ado, I'm gonna share my screen And I'm gonna get on with the content. Okay. View full screen. Okay. So the book is called How Humans Judge Machines, and it's coming out on September 29. You can register to get an email when it comes out at judgingmachines.com. AI is changing the world. AI is changing the way in which we harvest resources, in the way in which we pick fruit, is changing the way in which we organize things, store things, ship things, and deliver things. It's even changing the way in which we run some services, you know? And also is changing the way in which countries fight. But AI is also changing things in the service sector. Not only it is embodied in robots, but it is embodied in algorithms, for instance, that participate on human resource decisions, or even in the criminal justice system. So the question is, well, how do we judge AI? AI is now a technology that, on the one hand, is becoming a member of our society, and on the other hand, is different from other technologies because AI has the ability to learn. And therefore, it can perform actions that sometimes are not the ones that were hard-coded by a programmer, but that emerge as a consequence of that interaction between learning algorithms and the data they use to generalize the world. So is AI good or bad? Well, no, we know that machines can make mistakes and encode biases. There are many famous examples of machine making mistakes or encoding biases in ways that is completely unacceptable. But the problem is that humans also can make mistakes and encode biases. No, humans are not perfect either. So having a static preference for humans over machines is not necessarily correct. You know, it might be situations in which machines are not perfect and humans are worse, or situations in which machines are bad and humans are better. A priori, we don't know. That's why we do science. And the question that I'm going to ask here is the following. Well, is if I have, I'm trying to minimize this. Sorry, let me go back one. So if we have a human and a machine that make the same mistake, do they elicit the same reaction? And if they don't, if they elicit different reactions, how are those reactions different? And what factors of the problem or of the people judging the problem help us explain those differences in reaction? If the reaction would be the same, we would say that humans are judging machines and people in a way that it's fair compared to each other because they're judging only the action, not who is performing the action. But if the reaction is different, then we're going to have a bias because the reaction is going to depend on whether the action was performed by a human or a machine, not on the action that was taken. And the bias can be positive or negative. It might favor machines or it can go against them. So how can we answer a question of this type? Well, you know, we do something that is quite standard here. We use randomized experiments. So we assign people randomly to two groups of about 200 people each, and each group is going to see the same exact scenario, except that one group is going to see it as the action of a machine, while the other group is going to see it as the action of a human. Differences in reactions will tell us about biases that humans have for or against machines compared to humans. So it's a simple randomized psychological experiment. Now, to illustrate our technique and to introduce a few concepts, I'm going to use, an illustrative scenario. So consider the following situation. An excavator is digging up a site for a new building. Unbeknownst to the driver, the site contains a grave. The driver does not notice the grave and digs through it. Later, human remains are found. So in this scenario, you have an excavator that accidentally digs up a grave. That's not nice, but this could have been the action of an excavator operated by a human or an autonomous excavator. So would you judge this action differently if the driver was a human or a machine? So to understand, how people judge actions, whether they're machine actions or human actions, we first need to see a few concepts. And one concept that is important to understand here are the moral dimensions found in Jonathan Haidt's moral foundation theory. If you're not familiar with moral foundation theory, This is a theory that tells us that when people make moral judgments, we make moral judgments in different dimensions. These are kind of like different tastes in flavor. So you have like sweet and you have sour, you know, and you have salty. Well, when it comes to moral judgment, we also make moral judgments about different things, you know, and those are expressed in these 5 dimensions. There's also a version in which there's 6 dimensions in which fairness gets split into fairness and liberty. But here we use the simple version of the moral foundation theory, and we want to focus on 5 dimensions. The first one is harm care. So you can make a moral judgment about a situation in which someone was harmed or someone was not taken care of. You can also make moral judgments about situations that involve a lack of fairness, you know, situations that are unfair or unjust. You also make moral judgments about loyalty, you know, when people is unloyal or when people betray, you know, a group or a country, you know, we make moral judgments about that too. We also make moral judgments about authority when people break the rules or they, for example, disrespect elders. There is an authority figure that therefore represents some sort of directionality of interaction that violating it represents a moral violation. And there's also moral violations that involves things about purity or sanctity. These are things that we consider sacred, but doesn't necessarily involve harming someone or doing something that is unfair, unloyal or not. No? So for example, if we look at this scenario that I just presented, the one of this excavator that digged up a graveyard, how do we know which moral dimension does it trigger? And what we did is we ran a separate experiment in which each one of these scenarios were associated by people to 4 words in this list. Of course, we didn't give people the words with these titles. We just gave them like a scrambled list of words, but we knew that some of these words are associated, for example, with the harm dimension. So if something is harmful, is violent, or people say something is protective or caring, that means that that scenario is about the harm dimension. It's people describe the scenario as unjust, discriminatory, fair, or impartial, then we know that it's about fairness. The same way we have words for loyalty, authority, and purity, like indecent, obscene, decent, or virtuous. Well, how did people evaluate this scenario? When we run this data collection experiment, we find that this is a scenario of purity. When you dig up a grave, you're not harming anyone. You're not doing something that is unfair. You're not breaking loyalty or authority, but you're doing something that is considered in some way indecent, obscene, because there's something sacred about the human body. If I would have done the same scenario with some chicken bones that were buried on the building site, nobody would have cared because there is not something sacred about chicken bones as there is about human bones. So this is a scenario that triggers the moral dimension of purity. So this is the first part of our theoretical puzzle, the 5 moral dimensions that help us classify moral scenarios. The second thing that we need to consider is the role of intention. Okay, intention is extremely important when it comes to moral judgment and even to the law. So imagine the following 2 scenarios. A, Alice and Bob are 2 colleagues in a software company. They are competing for the same promotion at work. Alice has a severe peanut allergy. Knowing this, Bob sneaks into the office kitchen and mixes a large spoonful of peanut butter into Alice's soup. At lunchtime, Alice accidentally drops her soup on the floor, after which she decides to go out for lunch. She suffers no harm. So in this scenario, Bob intentionally puts in Alice's soup peanut butter, which he knows is going to harm her. And because of some fortuitous situation, she drops her soup and she is not harmed. But there is an intention of harm, even though there is no harm. Now look at the second scenario. Alice and Bob are 2 colleagues in a software company. They're competing for the same promotion at work. Alice has a severe peanut allergy, which Bob does not know about. Alice asks Bob to get lunch for them, and he returns with 2 peanut butter sandwiches. Alice grabs her sandwich and takes a big bite. She suffers a severe allergic reaction that requires her to be taken to the hospital, where she spends several days. So in this scenario, Bob is not trying to hurt Alice, but Bob's actions nevertheless result on Alice being hurt. So where would you blame Bob, or where do you think Bob did something wrong? And most people, and actually most legal codes, would agree that it's in the first scenario, in the one that was no harm, but there was intention to harm. Okay, that's because intention plays a huge role, especially on criminal law. Now, how can we think about intention in the context of machines? And you might think, well, it's hard to think of machines as having intention. But intention is not something that you either have or not, it's something more of a continuum. So for instance, an adult human is considered to be a moral agent and therefore to do actions with intentions. But a 2-year-old not necessarily is considered a moral agent. Actually, under the law, it is not. So their actions are not considered, as intentional as that of an adult, because that level of intention grows with age as people mature. Also, if you look at different species, like a dog might be considered more intentional than a worm, in its actions and so forth. Now, when it comes to a machine, a machine without the ability to learn, might be considered to completely be innocent of intention. But a machine with ability to learn might decide actions to fulfill goals that might have a little bit of intentionality built into them. Consider a self-driving car that was designed to protect the driver at all costs. And by doing so, in an accident situation, runs over a pedestrian in its effort to save the driver. Now consider the same situation, but consider a self-driving car that was programmed to save pedestrians at all costs. And in that same situation, it injures the driver. Well, it's not that the car had the intention to injure the driver or to injure the pedestrian, but the car performed an action as it was intended to. It found a solution that satisfied that higher goal of either saving pedestrians or saving the driver. So by acting as it is intended, and by finding a solution in a way that uses its own learning capacities, it performs something that is not intention, like in the human sense, but is similar to that. So if we take the Alice and Bove scenario, we can put this on this 3-dimensional space, which I'm going to call the moral space, in which we have harm on one axis, intention on the other axis, and wrongness on the y-axis, on the z-axis, or in the vertical axis. So for example, here we find the situation in which there was high intention and low harm, that in which Bob purposefully puts peanut butter on Alice's food, to be one in which intention is high, harm is very low, but the wrongness is very large. Okay. Similarly, when you have a situation with low intention and high harm, like in the case in which Alice does suffer a peanut butter allergic reaction, we have a situation where the harm is high, but the intention is low, and therefore the wrongness is low. Okay. And we can formalize this by using a function that says that the wrongness of a scenario is going to be a function of intention, the moral dimensions, harm, fairness, loyalty, authority, purity, and also the characteristics of the moral agent and the moral subject. The moral agent is the one that is performing the action. The moral subject is the one that is receiving the action, or the victim. Now, this helps us formalize this framing in which we have now machines and humans. They're making the same mistake. And our question now is, well, is this function f the same for humans and machines? By the end of this presentation, we are going to know. So just to finish, on our methodology, each one of these scenarios was evaluated in a number of different moral dimensions. Here I present, 11 different questions that people responded in reaction to this scenario. Was the action harmful? Would you hire this driver or this autonomous excavator for a similar job or position? Was the action intentional? Do you like the driver? How morally wrong or right was the action? Do you agree that the driver should be promoted or given more responsibilities? Do you agree that the driver should be replaced with a robot or an algorithm? That means replaced by the different type, replacing a human by a robot or a robot by a human. Do you agree that the driver should be replaced by another person? Or do you think that the autonomous excavator should be replaced by another autonomous excavator, replaced by the same? Do you think the driver is responsible for unearthing the grave? And if you were in a similar situation, would you have done the same? So this is what we find, for this scenario. So if you look at, for example, the harm dimension, and here red stands for machine and blue stands for human, we find that basically people assign, more harm to the machine action than the human action. Okay. So we start seeing a lot of difference. Then people also would be okay hiring that human again. They're not so okay giving another job to that same machine, even though the action was the same. When it comes to intention, it's almost a tie, but actually they give a little bit more intention to the machine than the human, and they like the human more. They find the action to be more morally correct when it was performed by a human. And if you go to the bottom of the chart, you see, would you have done the same on the similar situation? When we tell them that this was the action of a human, people think, probably I would have made the same mistake. When we tell them that this is the action of a machine, they think that they would not have made the mistake, okay? So they think that they would have done better. So we're starting to see that people do not judge humans and machines equally. Same scenario, same exact conditions, but different reactions from people when we present the action as that of a human or that of a machine. So let's look at a few more scenarios. Now we understand our methodology. We're doing randomized control experiments in which we have two groups, and we can use this to evaluate dozens of scenarios. So consider the following three versions of this moral dilemma. A large tsunami is approaching a coastal town of 10,000 people with potentially devastating consequences. The politician or algorithm responsible for the safety of the town can decide to evacuate everyone with a 50% chance of success or save 50% of the town with 100% success. So that's the setup. There are three possible solutions. The first one is that the politician or the algorithm decides to save everyone, but the rescue effort fails. The town is devastated and a large number of people die. So they try to do the right thing, but fail. Then the next outcome is the politician and algorithm tries to save everyone and it succeeds. Everyone is saved. People are happy. Okay. And the final outcome is the politician algorithm decide to save 50% of the town. So they take a compromise. They don't complicate themselves trying to save everyone. They say 50% of the people are saved. 50% of the people, are going to be left there to deal with it themselves. Okay. Now, when you look at the moral dimensions, this scenario triggers two dimensions. On the one hand, it triggers the dimension of harm. There is a tsunami that causes physical harm, on people and things. But there's also a dimension of fairness. Well, who are you going to save? Which 50% is the one that you're going to save? So it triggers those two dimensions, as you can see on the radar chart. Now, let's look at the results. So first, look at the right of your screen and look at the case in which the politician or algorithm take a compromise. And here you see that for the most part, people judge humans and machines the same, except for the replace difference scenario or question, which tells us that, if people would replace a machine that takes a compromise, but would not replace the human that takes a compromise. Now, don't read too much into this, because in general, people always want to replace that machine. That replace difference question is one in which machines always do very bad compared to humans. Let's move to the next outcome. Now, this is the one in which you try to save everyone and succeed. So this is like the lucky scenario, okay? So when it comes to harm, there's no harm either way, okay, that's fine, But when it comes to, well, would you hire or give more responsibility to this algorithm or politician? Do you think the action was intentional? Do you like it? Do you think the action was morally right? Would you promote it? There, the human is doing better, okay? So basically, even though the machine gets it right, it doesn't get as much credit as a human that gets it right. People also want to replace this machine even though it gets it right. They would not want to replace the politician, so they think, okay, in that case, the politician really should stay, and then they assign more responsibility to the action to the human, more responsibility to the outcome. And when it comes to having done the same on a similar situation, they feel a little bit more identified with the human. There's a p-value of 10 to the -3. Now let's look at the unlucky scenario. Here, try to save everyone and fail. And here's where we find like the big differences. People think that the machine did more harm, okay? The harm is the same, no matter who made the decision. But people see this as something more harmful when they see it as the action of a machine. People would give that politician a second chance. They would hire it. And when it comes to intention, they're almost comparable, So they see the action of the politician kind of like excusable when it gets it wrong. But when it gets it right, as we just saw, they see it as very intentional and they get the credit. They like the politician that tried and failed. They dislike the machine that tried and failed. They find that action of the politician that tried and failed to be morally right. The one of the machine to be a little bit towards the morally wrong side, is below the half, and so forth. So And finally, when we look at the similar situation dimension at the bottom left of your screens, then you're going to see that they see themselves as doing the same action when we present this as the action of a human. They don't think they would have done the same action when we present this as the action of a machine. So basically, when the machine took the risk and failed, people really didn't like it, even though they gave that human a second chance. And we can interpret that later, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep on moving to the next set of scenarios. So the next 4 scenarios are self-driving car scenarios. Here you have, on a sunny spring day, a driver or driverless car working for a supermarket chain accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. The pedestrian is hurt and is taken to the hospital. The next scenario is the same situation, but having a dog as a victim. The reason to have a human or a dog is just to change the moral status of the victim. Humans have higher moral status than dogs, okay? And these are scenarios that involve harm also in the context of an accidental situation. In this case, the human or the dog jumping in front of the car. On a cold and windy day, a driver or driverless car working for a supermarket chain swerves to avoid a falling tree. By swerving, the driver or driverless car loses control of the vehicle, leading to an accident that seriously injures a pedestrian on the sidewalk. Next, we have the same scenario, but with a dog as a victim. So in this case, there is an exogenous situation. It's not a person jumping in front of the car, but a tree falling, and a driver or a driverless car trying to avoid that falling tree. So how did people react? Well, in the 4 scenarios, we get relatively similar outcomes, except that, of course, people judge things a little bit more harshly when the victim was a human than a dog. But when it comes to harm, people find that it's more harmful, when the accident involves a self-driving car than a driver. And, when it comes to, for example, liking the driver, liking the car, they also make a big difference. But what is interesting here is the intention dimension, which is that here they assign, more intention to the machine than to the human. They basically are willing to excuse the human for being involved in this accident that is caused by exogenous reasons, but they're not willing to excuse the machine as much. They excuse it less, And that's interesting because when it comes to intention, if we haven't seen these experiments, our gut reaction is to assume that, we always think that humans have more intention than machines, but empirically that is not correct. In scenarios in which things are accidental, like people don't, know very well how to think about intention maybe, and they end up assigning more intention to the machine. They think that the machine maybe could have done something, while in the case of the human, they say, well, this is completely not your fault. Also, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you also will see that people find they find more identified with the human because they think that they would have done the same in a similar situation when we present this as the action of a human than a machine. And there's also a small difference in the moral judgment. They find the situation to be more moral, more correct when the mistake was made by a human than when it was made by a machine. So do humans always reject machines? Well, the thing is that there's some people that have been looking at whether people reject machines, and they've coined this concept of algorithm aversion, which is, well, people tend to avoid algorithms when they see them err. And so far, we've seen situations in which machines have not been doing very well. Yeah, people did not like the excavator that dug up a grave. People did not like the self-driving car that was involved in an accident. People did not like, the algorithm that made the decision and failed when it came to that tsunami. But is this always true, or are there cases in which algorithms are favored or seen as doing something more morally correct than a human that is doing the same? So let's look at these 2 examples. The first one, involves plagiarism. So a record label hires a songwriter or an AI songwriter, to write lyrics for famous musicians. The songwriter or AI songwriter has written lyrics for dozens of songs in the past year. However, a journalist later discovers that the songwriter or machine learning algorithm has been plagiarizing lyrics from lesser known artists. Many artists are outraged when they learn about the news. So this is a situation in which there's something that is unfair the algorithm or, the songwriter was plagiarizing, was taking credit for other people's work, and therefore it's not a harm situation like the ones that we've seen so far, but it's more on the fairness situation. Now let's look at this other scenario, which I borrowed from Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundation questionnaire. A family has a cleaner or robot in charge of cleaning their house. One day, the family finds that the cleaner or robot used an old national flag to clean the bathroom floor and then threw it away. So here, national flag symbols, they trigger like the loyalty and purity dimension. People do attribute some sort of like religious type of quality to national emblems like flags and anthems, and they also represent some sort of group loyalty, because breaking, your loyalty to those symbols is considered treason. But what is interesting for us about these two scenarios is that actually they represent examples in which people judge the action of the machine as more morally correct, than the action of the human. So for example, when it comes to the plagiarism example, people attribute a little bit more harm to a plagiarism done by human. And when it comes to the moral dimension that we see there, they see more morally incorrect, the action of the human than the action of the algorithm that did the same. Similarly, for the case of the cleaner, there we find a big difference, not in harm, but also in the moral dimension. They find the action to be much more morally wrong when there's a human that cleans a bathroom with a flag than when it is a robot. So this helps us, introduce ourselves into these ideas. But now what we're going to do is we're going to look at scenarios in two particular groups. First, we're going to look at scenarios about algorithmic bias, and then we're going to look at scenarios of labor displacement. After we do that, we're going to put different scenarios together in a chapter that is going to explore statistically the patterns that we look across multiple scenarios. So consider the following human resources screening situation. A company replaces the HR manager with a new manager or algorithm tasked with the screening candidates for job interviews. And here we have multiple outcomes. 3 of them are going to be unfair, and 3 of them are going to be fair. Okay, so then an audit reveals that the new manager or algorithm never selects Hispanic, African American, or Asian candidates, even when they have the same qualifications as other candidates. So here is a situation in which the algorithm is being unfair. And there is a situation in which the algorithm or the HR manager is going to correct an unfair situation. An audit reveals that the new manager or algorithm produces a fair process for Hispanic, African American, Asian candidates who were discriminated against by the previous system. Okay, so we have all of these conditions. Of course, it would be nice to have more conditions, for example, to include gender and other dimensions. The problem is that each one of these conditions involves recruiting a different group of about 200 people. So just to run this experiment, you need like 6 groups of 200. Now, if you look at the moral dimension that this scenario triggers, it triggers strongly the fairness dimension, okay? These are situations that are not so much about harm, purity, loyalty, but about situations being unfair. Okay? We run similar scenarios with other framings. For example, a college admission framing, there is a recruiter or algorithm that evaluates the grades, test scores, and recommendation letters of applicants. A policing scenario in which, police stops, people in neighborhoods, and they do it in a way that is unfair, or, they do it in a way that is more fair than they used to do it in the past. And also salary increases. Since all of these scenarios give very similar results, I'm just going to show, data for just one of them. So here you have Hispanic, African American, and Asian in the unfair treatment of one of these scenarios. And what we find is that people here put a little bit more harm, when the action was that of a human, and they say it a little less moral when the action was a human. So again, here the algorithm gets a little bit of a break, and in part, this is mediated statistically by intention. There's a situation in which when there is an unfair situation, people seem to put a lot of intention on human actions, but relatively middle intention levels to a machine. People also, despite judging the human worse, they still would be more likely to replace the machine than the human. So here the machine would be won and out, even though it's considered to be a little bit less morally wrong than the human. Now, when it comes to the fair treatment here, we're in a happy situation. There was an unfair situation and the algorithm helped correct it. But what do we find? Well, we find that the human gets a little bit more credit. It's considered to be more intentional. The machine once again gets replaced, and the human is considered to be more responsible for the action and the outcome. But for the most part, the reactions are quite similar. For example, they like both the machine and the human the same. They find the action to be morally correct to the same level in both cases. So it's more kind of like a matter of intention, responsibility, and replacement where we find the differences here. Now I'm going to look at a few examples from chapter 5, and this looks at another situation in which people have been making judgments about the ethics of artificial intelligence, which is labor displacement. So here we have several scenarios that involve people being replaced by machines or humans. In the case of humans, foreigners. So let's read this first scenario. A trucking company is looking to lower costs by bringing in temporary foreign drivers or autonomous trucks. This change reduces the company's cost by 30%, but several local drivers lose their job. So here we have a situation in which local people lose their jobs to either technology or foreigners, and in this case, it's what would be considered like a blue-collar job, like truck driving. Let's look at S53, scenario 53. A large chain of luxury resorts decides to lower the cost of staffing their poolside bars by bringing in temporary foreign workers or vending and cooking robots. The workers can take a guest room's number for payment purposes and serve a large variety of cocktails and dishes. As a result of the change, several local workers lose their job. So here we have a very similar situation. Either foreigners or technology replace blue-collar local workers. Next, we have a nuclear power plant that is looking to lower their operational costs. They decide to bring in 4 nuclear technicians or buy an AI operation system. This change allows the company to reduce their operational cost by 30%, but several local technicians lose their job. So once again, there is displacement, but what is different this time is that the job is a little bit more high skill. Here we're talking about nuclear technicians, not drivers, so that might change things, and as you can see from the radar charts, this all also triggered the fairness dimension. A school is looking to lower their costs by bringing in foreign teachers or adding robot teachers to some of their classes. This looks more realistic with COVID, doesn't it? As a result, the school reduces its cost by 30%, but fires several local teachers. So let's see how people reacted to these labor displacement scenarios. So when it comes to the truck driving scenario, there you see big differences, okay? Would you approve, of this change? People approve of the change when it's, based on technology more than when it involves, foreign workers. Would you ban, and here, of course, the 50% line is important because we're in a political type of situation, so simple majorities tend to matter in the forms of democracy that we have right now. People would ban the foreign workers. People would not ban the technology. Do you find this to be morally incorrect? They find it more morally incorrect. When it's humans that come and take those jobs. Would that improve or destroy the opinion that you have about that company? Well, company would lose reputation more if they're hiring foreigners. Do you think that others approve? People think that others would approve less of foreigners. Would you have done the same on a similar situation? Not when it comes to foreigners. Yes, when it comes to, machines. And now, when we look at the hotel scenario below the trucking scenario, we see the same pattern, but not so pronounced. We see the effects to be a little bit smaller. When we look at the nuclear technician scenario, now we're, borderline significant, in some cases insignificant. So here, people tend to be more accepting of the foreigners or as accepting as technology in comparison when we move to this high skill scenario situation. And when it comes to the final scenario that we presented, the one of the teachers, here we find no differences, but this is because they don't like either. They don't approve, and they would want to ban both robot teachers and foreign teachers. You know? So this is a case in which basically we have like a floor or ceiling effect, depending on which dimension you're looking at. Let's look at a few scenarios, and here we're going to have more options of human displacement. A law firm is looking to lower their costs for routine clerical work. They decide to open a branch in a low-income country, hire a foreign contractor, bring in foreign workers with temporary visas, replace older workers with younger workers, or buy an AI legal system. The result is a reduction of costs and the firing of their several local staff. So this is also a fairness situation scenario, but here you have either technology or you have offshoring, outsourcing, foreign workers, or replacement of older workers with younger workers. So there are 4 human options. We do the same with a hospital, a manufacturing company, a software firm, and a few other situations. But for the most part, we find a very similar pattern. You know, so once again, they like being replaced by a human less than they like being replaced by a machine. You know, but among all of these human options, some of them are more permissible or admissible than others. For example, when it comes to hiring younger workers and replacing older workers by younger workers, you know, people find that to be unacceptable, you know, in comparison to offshoring or outsourcing. Foreign workers don't do that well either. People tend to have kind of like this local bias, at least in the sample. This is all US-based sample in this experiment, you know. Then when it comes to offshoring and outsourcing, people find that to be a little bit more acceptable, especially offshoring, you know, and that also goes into kind of like a in-group, out-group bias, because offshoring means that you have other people working in the same company in another country, you know, so there is a dimension in which you're still part of the same group, you know, it's the same company, even though it's not the same country. And offshoring is considered to be the most admissible of all of these options. But technology still, you know, reigns king when it comes to labor displacement, you know, which is interesting because there is a lot of conversation about the fear of labor displacement based on technology, but it seems that the fear of labor displacement based on generational shifts or foreigners is actually stronger. So can we put all of this together? Can we try to answer the question that we asked at the beginning, which is, well, are these functions different? We have seen a lot of differences, but can we map those to a function? You know? So what I'm going to do now is going to present a few of the results that we have in the book in this chapter. The first one is going to show descriptive statistics, and the second one is going to explore these moral functions for the judgment of AIs and humans. So what are we going to do? We're going to get all of the data that we have from all of the scenarios that I showed you, and many, many scenarios more, because probably I showed you about like 10, 15% of the scenarios that we did. And then by putting all of that together, we're going to be able to now look at things that are common across the scenarios instead of things that are different across the scenarios. So we're going to go back to our modal space interpretation. So here, we're going to have a 3-dimensional space with harm, intention, and instead of having modal, I'm going to have wrongness, which is 1 minus modal. Basically, I'm going to invert that axis. So the larger that is, the more wrong something is considered to be. And here, each scenario is going to be represented by 2 dots connected by a line. Those 2 dots represent how that scenario was judged when it was seen as the action of a human, and how it was judged when it was seen as the action of a machine. And we use a line because we want to make sure that we know which blue dot corresponds to which red dot. So this is how like this modal space looks like, you know. There is like a diagonal plane where these things live, you know, and that diagonal plane is there because in some way, when you do something that has, you know, no intention, even if it has a lot of harm, you know, it's considered to be not fully wrong. And when you have something with a lot of harm and a lot of intention, well, it's going to be considered wrong. And when you have something with no harm and no intention, it's going to be considered right. So there's some corners that are forbidden, and the points fall in kind of like some sort of plane. But at the same time, we do see differences in the way that the red dots and the blue dots distribute. So let's look at each one of the faces of this cube. So here we're looking at the cube from the top, and we look at the harm and intention plane. And this is a very interesting result because it tells us that when it comes to the judgment of intention, humans judge the intention of other humans bimodally. They say humans either assign a lot of intention to other humans or they excuse them. But when it comes to machines, they assign these intentions more or less in this meh type of level in the middle. Yeah, they don't make a big difference. So that's an interesting result because it tells us that even in something as basic as the distribution of a single variable, in this case intention, we have strong differences. When humans judge humans, they do it using a bimodal distribution. When humans judge machines, they use something that is more similar to a unimodal distribution. Now let's look at the intention wrongness plane. And here we see kind of like this fanning out. Yeah. So when intention is low, wrongness is neither too high, neither too low. So you cannot do great things or horrible things without intention. Accidental things, have a very narrow level of wrongness. But when those accidental things involve machine actions, they're considered worse than when they involve human actions. So when intention is low, when things are accidental, machines get canned, humans get excused. But now when we move to situations in which there's a lot of intention, then intention enhances moral judgment, and there the humans are considered doing something worse when the action is wrong, or doing something better when the action is right. And that's what we see in this chart. Now, when we look at harm, we find that harm does correlate with wrongness. So when there's a lot of harm, even if there's no intention, apparently people do assign some wrongness to those situations nevertheless. But what we find is, for example, when the level of harm is very low, people tend to be unhappier with the action of a machine. At the intermediate level of harm, we find the same. And at the top, we find a situation in which this reverses. Just so you know, and this is in the book all labeled and presented in much more detail than I can do in this presentation. These scenarios in which this situation reverses are scenarios that involve fairness. These are the algorithmic bias scenarios presented on the fairness chapter. So there, people see more harm and more wrongness on human actions. So these are just descriptive statistics. These are just how the dots fall, in this three-dimensional space. So what we're going to do next is we're going to model this. Okay, so we're going to grab that moral function, we're going to simplify it a lot, and we're just going to have wrongness as a function of intention and harm, and also, subject fixed effects. So these are, we added dummies for each one of the subjects to control for differences among the study participants. So if a subject tended to judge everything very positively or very negatively, that is controlled by the fixed effects. If we expand this function, to first order, what we're going to have is that wrongness is a coefficient b as a function of harm, another coefficient times intention, another coefficient as a function of harm and intention. That's an interaction term. Higher order terms didn't contribute that much, so I decided to keep things clean, by doing it this way. Okay, so how do these planes look like? Well, so this is how they look when we do multivariate statistics. So we introduce the variables sequentially, so you can see how they contribute. But what I'm going to look at here, more than anything else, is at column 4 and 5, which is a model to try to explain wrongness as a function of intention, harm, a constant, and the function of the interaction of harm and intention. And in model 5, there's no constant, of course, because I include subject fixed effects. So each subject gets its own constant, and that's how we control for constant factors of subjects. And what we see there in the coefficients is that when it comes to intention, you see kind of like that negative coefficient. When it comes to the interaction term, you see that positive coefficient. And when you see harm, you see a large, a positive coefficient. So, when we look at wrongness for machines, like intention doesn't appear to play a big role, and really is harm the one that it's explaining the lion's share of the variance, and also of the slope. Now, when we look at machines, at human judging humans, we find a different situation. Here, harm is not that strong, and it is the interaction term between harm and intention, the one that really matters. Look at that coefficient, 0.54. That's really strong. These, remember, are variables that are going between 0 and 1. So that's a really strong coefficient. That interaction term, is really dominant here. The fixed effects models here also explain a lot of the variance. Even though we have 13,000 observations, we get to explain 68% of the variance, with this simple fixed effects model. And this is how these models look graphically. So here the red plane is the plane that assigns wrongness, to the actions of machines as a function of intention and harm, and the blue plane is the one that assigns wrongness to the actions of humans as a function of the intention and harm that people perceive in those scenarios. And you see that the functions are clearly not the same. And the big difference is the one that we saw on the regressions when it comes to, humans judging machines. The main dimension that explains, this function is the harm dimension. So the slope moves more than anything on that dimension. When it comes to human judging humans, is this diagonal, and there's a little bit of a curvature because of that interaction term. That is the one that explains, this function the most, So to simplify this, we have kind of like a big, coarse aggregate simplified conclusion, but that nevertheless, I think is extremely interesting, which tells us that if we have humans and machines making the same mistakes, and we try to measure the functions that govern those reactions, we find that they're different, and they follow the following principle. People judge humans by their intentions and machines by their outcomes. And there's a lot of interesting implications that come from that. But for the time being, I'm going to stop there. This is the book. This is how humans judge machines. Please don't think that this presentation is by any means a replacement of the book. Like what I presented here today is just a small sample. It's all of the pages there that you see in blue. I borrow content from those pages for the presentation, but there's much more in the book. There's a lot of discussions, on algorithmic bias that review the literature and that look at how to deal with it. There's a whole chapter on privacy that I didn't even touch on. There's a whole discussion on different, forms in which labor displacement might affect society, whether it's by the precarization of work or other forms. In the labor displacement chapter, there's a lot of implications for society and the economy and governance that I describe in the conclusions. There's, a summary of literature on moral philosophy and moral psychology that I also did not, cover here. So there's much more for you to see, and there's many more scenarios for you to explore. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time. The book is going to be available starting September 29 at judgingmachines.com. It's going to be available for free. So if you want to use it as teaching materials, please, you're welcome to do so. And there's also going to be an online course that I'm recording and producing with a production team that we're going to release next winter. That is also going to be available for free. The print version of the book is going to be paid, and it's going to come out with MIT Press on February of next year. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to hear your questions and join the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cesar. Fascinating, really fascinating presentation. I enjoyed it very much. It was really impossible not to keep full attention to what you were saying because it was so interesting. So thank you very much for your presentation. Of course, we will have some questions from the audience as well, but can I just abuse a little bit of my power and saying that I think the results that surprised me the most was that throughout your presentation, I know you were doing randomized controlled experiments, but at the same time, I kept on thinking, as you said, right? I'm wondering if there is a difference between gender. I'm wondering if there is a difference between people of different age, or when you were talking about labor displacement, which is something that I'm really keen on, I was thinking about, okay, maybe political parties, stuff like that, right? Because you associate your political views with different kind of moral values. But then you disprove everything by just putting the fixed effect, individual fixed effect in it. And so I think that the most fascinating thing is that no matter how different we are, there is some commonality that applies to all the human beings, all the people that were in your sample. And I assume that they were of different age, right? Yeah. So they were really random.
So in the book, we do actually both. I didn't show the other part. So we do this part in which we do fixed effects for individuals to look at what's common across them.
Yeah.
And then we have another part, which I didn't show, in which we do fixed effects for the scenarios. And we look how the individual characteristics affect their judgment. And there, for example, we have some interesting results. For instance, we find men to be more pro-machine and females to be a little bit more pro-human, if we would call the position to be one or the other. We also find that people's favorable impression of machines tends to increase with education. You know?
Yeah, that was another dimension I was wondering about, Cesar. I was wondering exactly about gender, political parties, education. I don't know if you know what party they vote, and probably...
Yeah, so we ask people not party, but conservative liberal. We ask them to rate themselves on that. Right. So yes, we looked at that and we find interesting effects there as well. But nevertheless, even though the effects are there and they're significant, they are not very strong, you know? So like, in some way, you have to add a bunch of those demographic effects to get something that really starts moving the estimate. So, so for instance, education, Asian and male, all in the same direction.
Yeah,
you know? So now, if you add those three effects, now you're starting to get to something that might add a little bit to your predictive power. But otherwise, you know, like you're really having significant differences, but because also the sample size is large, you know, not necessarily because like being a female explains a lot of your preference for machines. Explains a tiny fraction compared to the variation that you observe in the scenarios.
Got it, yes. Yeah. Even if it's a small part, I find fascinating that you do find a gender difference, because there is all this debate going on also in the workplace about female being a little bit more empathic. Well, that seems to be the case, because if they are more forgiving towards humans, it probably means that they empathize more. Like there is this in-group bias, so to speak, where the in-group is the whole of humanity and the out-group is the machine, with which is really impossible to empathize because they have nothing in common with us, well, almost nothing. And
although Hollywood has made sure that we learn to empathize with machines like WALL-E.
That's true. I mean, there are also exceptions to that, but you know, it's like the in-group in this case, the whole human beings, and the out-group is actually the machine. And so,
and that's what some people are saying. For example, there was a paper recently from a group of psychologists that they were saying, well, you know, if machines are going to give us a new in-group, out-group to help promote pan-humanism. You know, because nowadays the in-group, out-group are very national in politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? And they were, so they did some experiments and they found that, yes, apparently like having the machines be the out-group help us, you know, be a little bit nicer or more empathic across human out-groups.
They scare us so much that we are even willing to be, you know, more together, even if we are different. Okay, so I think I talked enough. And so is there any question from any of the participants here
Gloria can join
in the
us
Zoom?
with some questions.
Yeah. Is there anybody? Oops, there is something here. Okay, so Benjamin, you can actually talk, right? I can read your question, but if you want, you can turn your video on. Can they actually do that, the attendees?
I think so.
Allow to talk.
Benjamin?
Okay.
Okay. Join us, Benjamin.
Yes, don't speak in Spanish, even though you can. Yes, from Chile.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, great. Hi, Cesar. Great presentation. I shared the same impression with Alessandra, that was very captivating and very, very interesting. So I know you might this might be a derivative question, but also very interesting for us about how do you think all this judgment will interact with geography, I know this is based in the US, and maybe you think that geography might be kind of space blind, but we all have to this bias here in our discipline, that we always focus somehow on space. How do you think if the experiment will be repeated in different regions, continents, geopolitical circumstances will pan out? Like, just as a way, if you have the biggest possible experiment, probably.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that we wanted to do, and we're going to try to do now. Like, part of the reasons to launch the book online and make it free is hopefully to get a lot of people to participate and to run this same type of experiments with a sample that, you know, is not just US based only, which in this case was based on mechanical Turk. Because I do think that the things are going to vary with space, you know, and maybe quite a lot. You know, I cannot tell for sure, but my prior sort of hypothesis so far would be that, for instance, in places like China or Japan, you know, people have been much more in contact with robots and machines than in parts of the West, and they might be, you know, they might have already developed better mental models about them and be more empathic to them, you know, or more accepting of them. In other places that might not be. So I do expect geographic variation on responses, you know, and that's one of the papers that we want to do after this, you know, like one of the reasons to do kind of like big work like this is that then there's a lot of things that you can do to start filling up the gaps as a way to fill up a research agenda. The other part of your question, you know, I think it's about how this interacts with the geography of jobs, you know, and there my view is that when it comes to that, labor displacement, it's a revolution that it's not going to be evenly distributed when it comes to geography. I do think that automation, it's more or better adapted to control situations in capital intensive industries. So I think that it is mining. In mining, self-driving trucks have been operating for 15 years. Okay, so the self-driving car for the cities is still, you know, technological idea, you know, because it's only experimental right now. While in mining, you know, the autonomous hauling vehicles are actually common. In farming, fruit picking robots, also there's a lot of startups and a lot of companies, you know, in that space, because these are controlled environments. So the revolution is going to come from the farm and the mines to the cities, not that way around. You know? So that's also when it comes to the geography of jobs, where I think the geography of jobs is going to change in the cities. It's not first on robots, but on software robots, you know, on robots that are not necessarily physically embodied as much, you know, but that are digitally embodied as the robots that we see on Twitter every day, you know, and of course, you know, robots that they participate today in advanced parole systems, in, you know, human resource decisions, all of that. But what's the geography of those robots? Is it where the algorithm is running? Is it in the company that is using it? Is it in the company that it developed? They are like the context of geography. It's harder for a disembodied robot compared to like one that is, you know, embodied in a metal machine. You know? Yeah. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Sorry, I know that Sandro wanted to ask a question, but before Sandro asks his question, for all the people that are attending, actually, you have to write in the chat if you want to ask a question. Just write, I want to ask a question, because I have to allow you to talk, because at the moment you are only attendees. So if I don't unblock you, you can't really talk. So write in the chat and I will add you to the panelists. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sandro?
Yeah, this is something that we'll need to adjust for the next webinar, actually. Yeah, fantastic presentation. It was really, really fascinating, interesting, and me, myself, also thinking a lot about the implications of these results. But before going to implications, I got a sort of technical question about the way in which the person that have been interviewed about the reactions of machines and humans have been instructed about the intelligence of the machines they were facing. Were they all of them equipped with the same kind of info? So were they thinking the same way about the kind of machines they were actually in front of them, or maybe that there were some heterogeneity in their way of thinking how clever of our intelligent the machines are, and in case to which extent these things could have affected the results. This is the first kind of technical question. And then I got a question about the implications. You rightly refrain from talking about implications because we need to read the book. I fully agree with that. But I mean, I think that the dimensions that you have actually extrapolated, so these new dimensions about how humans evaluate artificial intelligence has got a lot of implications on the diffusion of artificial intelligence, in particular at the company level. I was thinking whether you could at least summarize or give us some brief hints about this kind of implications in terms of the diffusion of artificial intelligence, in particular at the company level.
Yeah. So to the first question, like within the sample, of course, there was heterogeneity on how people thought about machines and so forth, but that doesn't affect the results because it's a randomized controlled trial. So if you have someone that really hates robots or someone loves robots, they have the same probability of being assigned to the human or to the machine condition. And people don't see other condition, you know? So like the experiment was running in a lot of batches of around, 10 to 15 different scenarios that we would run. And like a person that would answer the scenarios about machines would only answer the scenarios about machines, and a person that would answer the scenarios about human would only answer the scenarios about human, and they would never be able to participate again in this experiment. So people didn't know that we were comparing humans and machines. People just answered 15 questions about machines or 15 questions about humans, and they never saw, like the other questions, and because they were randomly assigned, both groups have the same number of people that like machines and the same number of people that hated machines because they were randomly assigned. So that's kind of like the beauty of the random assignment here. Now, can you repeat me your question about the implications?
Yeah. I was thinking, what do you think would be the implication of this new dimension that is the way in which humans actually judge, evaluate machine, artificial intelligence? Which kind of effect do you think could have on the adoptions of artificial intelligence, in particular at the company level? Do you think that would change the way in which this technology is adopted?
Okay, so that's an interesting question because, like, in some way, the study that I presented today, it's a snapshot in time of how a group of people thought, in the year, I think the data was collected mostly at the beginning of 2019, and late 2018, early 2019, because morals are cultural, they're learned. Yeah, like the way that we think about, morality today and 70 years ago and 300 years ago is very different. A lot of things that were permissible before are not permissible today, or things that were not allowed before are allowed today. So morals are changing all the time. They're culturally learned. There's a lot of culture in morality. So the way that I see this is on the one hand, this tells us, today how people perceive machines. But that doesn't mean that that's the way that people are going to perceive machine in 10 or 15 years from now, and also, it tells us that, for the most part, like people tend to have kind of like a very utilitarian way of viewing and judging machines, which is like, if the machine did harm, no matter what the situation or how unlucky the situation was, they tend not to like it. If the machine did good, they're not thrilled about it either. It's kind of like it did what was supposed to, and I think what we see here is that this might cause kind of like a friction, in the context of technology adoption, especially on some situations, more than others, because at the end of the day, I do think that what we want to shoot for, if I will do any more normative statement, which I try to avoid in the book at all costs, is that we should at least be paying attention, to whether we're judging machines fairly or not, because if we judge machines unfairly and we are too hard for them in situations in which they're actually improving things, we're going to miss opportunities. And if we are too soft on them in situations in which they're causing harm, we're going to be, making some situations worse. But to me, it was not clear whether we were judging machines fairly or not, because so far people were just judging machines without any counterfactual. And as a scientist, I need 2 points to make one observation. I need to have that comparison. So I think hopefully this is going to start that conversation. And of course, this can be used strategically by managers and people in companies, in a context in which they say, okay, if our machine screws up and the screw up is on this or that dimension, are we going to get a break, or are we going to get, canned? And in some way, what it's telling you, like compared to humans, like people seem to tolerate a little bit more of an unfair machine, even though there has been a lot of heat on that space, but they really do not tolerate a violent machine or a machine that is involved in a situation that involves harm, so there is kind of like some differential effect, depending on moral dimensions. Another thing that is in the book, but it was not in the presentation, is that when you use machines, and we did some experiments of that, people tend to centralize responsibility. Okay, so if you want to delegate actions to machines or to groups of people, and the actions are risky, it might be better to delegate them to people, not because the outcome is going to be better, but because you're going to be able to blame them when the outcome goes bad, and politics has a lot of that, of delegating things and, having other people take the fall when they fail and having the superiors take the credit when you succeed, so there is a political dimension there that you need to consider too, which comes out clean out of the data. There's a big difference, when there's a machine involved, the responsibility goes to the central actor of the network. When there is a human, it acts as a firewall for responsibility.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just very quickly, because something came to mind. You mentioned this violent behavior, right? They don't tolerate that more than other dimensions. And I was just thinking, but think about how artificial intelligence and machines have been depicted in movies. What's the worst that they can do? Start going crazy and killing people. I mean, I can remember a lot of movies like this. So maybe it's the way that also they've been portrayed that make the people be more scared of one dimension than the other. Of course, we don't know if that's the case, but it was just something that came to mind, that probably it's also our fault, humans' fault, in the sense that we depict them in a certain way that probably has had no sense at all. I don't know if there is any other question from anybody. They're very scared of asking you questions.
No,
Cesar, because
how I've been neat at answering them.
Oh, here. Okay, so there is one. I'm just trying to allow this person to talk. Sorry. Fabiano, I think you can talk now. Fabiano? It says talking permitted, so now you should be able to talk.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'd like you to ask you a question, which is basically we had the COVID. You told us that the focus group were gathered together at the end of 19, at the end of 18, and the beginning of 19. Do you think that it's just to speak about, but do you think that after the coronavirus experience, these results can change somehow? Thanks.
Yeah, they might. Like coronavirus is changing a lot of things, in terms of the way that people interact and behave and their engagement with technology. So that's an interesting question. You even kind of like have like a good identification strategy there, because you can take the severity of coronavirus, as an exogenous shock on the adoption of technology by people, at least not AI, but video conferencing and teleconferencing technology. Because in some places, for example, I have a lot of friends in China that are kind of like back to normal by now. They sort of did a good job and they're able to resume their lives. And so I do think it might, but I wouldn't know in what direction. At the same time, so many things have happened, at the same time, and there has been, like events in which AI has been shown to be, biased again, and the US is a country in which a lot of this discussion happens, which is today very politically active in terms of, racial divisions that also interact with these ideas and these technologies. So it's very hard to know, where the ball is gonna jump, when you kick it in this situation, if it's gonna, if over the last year, people have become more afraid of machines, or they've become, more accepting of them. I wouldn't adventure a hypothesis, but I would be open to the idea that yes, things probably changed.
Sorry, on this, did you find, going back, sorry, I promise I'll read your book as soon as it's out, but since, you know it all, and on this, I was thinking, the familiarity that people have with the machine may play a role. Now, going back to the demographic characteristics, I know you said they don't really explain very much, but not even age. I mean, old people maybe are not that familiar, because if it's also a generational thing, then maybe as we get more used to the machines and we know them a little bit more, aside from education, but really in terms of practicing with them, I don't know. So the younger people might be less biased than older people. You don't find anything on age,
no,
right?
So age did have some small effect, but I also expected more. And thinking about it, then I think one of the reasons why maybe age didn't have such a strong effect as I expected, is that like young people are also among the strongest activists against technology. So a lot of the people that are kind of like against AI and against face recognition and everything, they're not 70-year-old guys, They are also very young. So I think that it might be that kind of like there's also kind of like a polarization there, and unfortunately we're measuring average effects. So
sure.
The average is the average between this or the average and that is the same average.
They're very much black and white young people, right? Really
may
against.
Be,
it might be.
But we didn't find I thought age was gonna like be a strong correlate, and it was a mild correlate,
Because of course, God knows what's going to happen in 10 years as we get more used to the machines. Of course, you can repeat these in 10 years, but we don't want to wait 10 years. So age could have been a good proxy of this generational effect. But of course, you might be right that there is also this effect. There is a question from Adriana Pinate. That's interesting because Adriana does behavioral economics.
Okay.
So.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you well.
Perfect. Very interesting. For sure, I'm going to read it because I'm going to see the treatments and everything. I have a question. Like, it's like a double issue. Did you find that your results can be a line of potential ethical approaches that could be used in building ethical autonomous machines? Like implement this ethical behavior in robots, because from what I see from your findings, there is a very, like as Alessandra was saying, age, gender, there is not, I don't know, like demographic individual characteristic that affect the answer. So I don't know if you think that, because I know that now machines artificial intelligence is trying to bring moral issues to the machines in the decision making. Not use more decision making, but use like agent, deep consequence, and other type of model. So my question is, you think that this is possible from your findings? And second, if you think to use experimental economics, like trying with risk, like see if the level of risk have difference on the answering of the person, like that machine perhaps do that mistake 1 for 1 million. So how risky you are for or playing with that too, because there is a very high correlation among the concepts of risk and how people tendency have a moral issue too. And thank you, amazing, really amazing.
Thank you, Adriana. These are very good questions. So on the first question, like very early on the book, I talk about like the difference between normative and positive philosophy. Yeah. So normative philosophy is how the world should be. Positive philosophy is the way the world is. And most people in ethics, they only do normative work. So positive work is even kind of like a hard pill to swallow for them. The book is very positive because honestly, I do think that you need to understand first, how the world behaves, and then focus your efforts on how it should behave, and start kind of like from some sort of point in which you are working on problems that are relevant. So I try in the book as much as possible to stay away from normative philosophy, and also I don't think that the way that the world is the way that the world should be either, So this is the way that the world is. This is how people judge machines. Should people judge machines this way? Not necessarily. This is just the way that they do. So I've been very reticent to doing that. I don't think I'm ready to make kind of like to take a strong normative position yet. So that's why I decided to stay on the positive side. So I agree, it's a great question. It's an important question, but I don't think what we have in this book would yet be like enough to have an answer of how machines should behave. I think it contributes to that adventure, but it doesn't help us answer. Now, with respect to the risk, we did think about it, at the beginning, actually, with all academic projects, you have like these ambitions, and then you start doing the stuff, and then you start narrowing down into doing fewer things and focusing. And we had this idea of like saying, okay, you have a machine that performs cardiac surgery, and it has a 95% chance of success, or a 90% chance of success, or an 85% chance, and then you have a doctor that does that, and to try to see kind of like those sensitivity curves, and we didn't do that. And there's other people, I think is Vietborgs, the same one that has this algorithmic aversion paper, that did a study on that already. So that's something that some people are exploring. It is a lot of work, because you have to map out a continuum with experiments and do that. So it's a great question, actually. So good that we try to pursue it. Other people are pursuing it. So I wouldn't dissuade you from pursuing it, because I think there's always more to do on that space. Thanks, Adriana.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. We have now a question from one of our PhD students, Carlo, who actually has a background in criminology.
Oh.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. It has been an honor and a pleasure to attend your this lesson. That was amazing to me, that I'm quite new to this kind of behavioral economic studies, but I mean, they're really amazing, I have to admit. So thank you very much. My comment is regarding the comparison that you made and that you presented between, let's say, the decision where to, I mean, if the response about machines to be replaced by machine or to be replaced by foreigner workers.
Okay.
So I think that it is amazing and scaring at the same time, because apparently, at least in United States, machines are not so foreigner as people coming from other states. So, I mean, I don't know if you deepen this kind of relation, and maybe if you think that this is a matter of, I don't know if it is correct to call it racism, or a matter of get used to be used to the presence of high technological machines. And if, for example, that could be differences in this relation between countries, let's say developing countries, in which maybe the presence of technological stuff are not so huge as in countries like United States. I don't know if my question makes sense. Thank you.
No, it's a good question. Actually, in the book, we do put a comment about that on the chapter, precisely for those reasons, because the US is peculiar in which it is a country that has a lot of foreigners and foreigners from all over the world, because in Europe, there's a lot of like cross-European,
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but there's very few Asians in Europe in comparison, and here is a country that there's a lot of foreigners, but at the same time, there's strong feelings that a lot of people have about migration. So we do speculate that it might be that framing migrants as people that are displacing jobs might trigger people in uncomfortable ways, and we might be getting a US-based response. At the end of the day, that's an empirical question, and if we would run the study on Italy, we might see, okay, you know, maybe in Italy it's different, or maybe it is the same. I would expect there to be some variation on that, because you know, cultures might differ on how they think about, you know, migration, and also they differ on their experience with both technology and migration. There are countries that historically have had a lot of migration, other countries that historically have had little international, you know, migration. In any case, I think one of the things that this last wave of globalization has taught us, that countries that, for example, didn't have migrants for a long time and then they started getting migrants, there's groups of people that get activated against them relatively quickly, you know, and that's not to generalize to the whole country, but in all countries, there seem to be that groups of people that have become, you know, hostile to migrants. For example, I come from Chile. Chile is a country that the last wave of migration ended in the 30s, you know, and then there was basically no migration for a long time. And the newest wave of migration was the one that we had now between the middle of the 2000s until recently, you know, and I was not living in Chile all of this period, but the political landscape changed quite a bit, and migrants all of a sudden became a topic and an issue, you know, in a country that they had not been for a long time. So to me, it was surprising to see how quickly, you know, that can become a political topic. You know, I think in Italy, you also had a wave of migration in the last 10 years, and that also had its own, you know, political ramifications. Yeah.
Certainly did. If there aren't any more questions, I think we have used of Cesar's time enough already. So 3, 2, 1. Good. Cesar, you told us before that you're going to move to Europe mid-October. So we wish you best of luck. And we're really happy that you are moving to Europe. So you're going to be closer. And maybe when you are at the University of Toulouse, there will be even more opportunities to interact. As you've seen, we have quite few South American. In fact, 2 of them ask you questions today. And so we already are interacting a lot with people from that part of the world. Thank you very much, Cesar. It was a real pleasure. Your presentation was amazing and everybody enjoyed it. And so thank you very much. And hopefully, you know, we'll see you soon, and have a very safe and good trip to France in mid-October.
Thank you. Thank you, Alessandra. I look forward to being in Europe. You know, and now I'll go for lunch, and you guys can go for the Aperol Spritz.
Yes, correct. We are gonna offer you one if you ever come to visit L'Aquila.
I have them here already.
Wonderful food and wonderful aperitivi, as you know. So we are waiting to hosting you here at some point. Prego.
Thank you. Ciao, Alessandra. Ciao, Sandro. Ciao,
Bye.
Gloria.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye.